Today on the Gyaan Project, we are joined by historian and UCLA professor Vinay Lal. It's an honor to speak to someone of his stature and knowledge. We'll talk about learning, not just in schools, but in life. From memory and media to history and politics. Why learning might be our first step towards true awareness. This episode is for young Indian questioning education, parents rethinking how children learn, and seekers looking to unlearn and see a world new. Let's begin. Welcome, Vinay sir, to the Gyaan Project, and thanks for giving your time.
My pleasure.
So we'll directly jump into topic of the day, which is what is learning, and we'll unravel more questions as we go along. But if we can start by setting the context, what do you mean by learning?
Well, the question is actually quite difficult. Let me begin with that. It's quite difficult because let's think of the various synonyms that people use when they are thinking about learning. So I think one common synonym is obviously education. Knowledge is another one. We know that they're not actually synonyms, but people will often use these words as
Interchangeably.
synonyms interchangeably. And then there are words such as pedagogy, which is more likely to be used by people who are educators, for example. I think, common people may not use it that often, but teachers and educators will use the word pedagogy. So learning is, how should one think about it? One can think about it as moving to a different state of awareness, a different state of consciousness. Now, commonly, when people think about learning, when they think about the acquisition of certain kinds of skills or information or knowledge, right? So let's say if you're thinking about learning in history, it means the acquisition of certain kinds of information, data, information about dates and events. I am giving, in fact, a rather different interpretation to the word learning because I'm saying that the intent of learning should be to move the learner from one state of awareness to another state of awareness. One would think a higher state of awareness, obviously, a higher state of consciousness. Now, I think that that's what learning is. It's not simply the acquisition of data or the acquisition of information, right? There are other ways in which one can amplify the idea of learning because one can think about learning as a process, a manner, a way in which one acquires a body of knowledge about a certain subject. I think that would be another way to really look at learning. And then I'm going
Learning.
to offer a third way. And both the first two ways that I've offered, I think, are perhaps a bit of a departure from a very conventional understanding of it. But I think that one can also think of learning as a conversation. Now, that conversation is not taking place in the ordinary sense of a conversation, but if learning is taking place, for example, let's say in a classroom, usually it takes place in a classroom. There's another set of problems I think associated with that. We can talk about it later on. But usually, at least in the modern setting, learning takes place in a classroom. And then when it takes place in a classroom, it means that there is someone who is imparting that learning and someone who is a recipient of it. And therefore, I'm suggesting that we can also think of it as a form of conversation, albeit a certain kind of conversation, right?
Correct,
So
correct,
these are
correct.
some of the ways in which I would start to begin to think of learning.
And when you said a higher level of understanding, are you pointing to any hierarchy here, or it just like truth and then more truth?
Yeah, no, it's not a question of hierarchy. That is to say that you move from one state where you have a certain kind of awareness, a certain kind of knowledge, a certain kind of understanding, and then you move to a state where you have a more enhanced awareness. Now, that enhanced awareness may also come at some cost because too much learning, for example, can be a burden. You see, so that's why it's not really a hierarchy. So, for example, when you look at creativity, right? Now, there are many studies that have been done of creativity, and many of these studies of creativity have shown that the most interesting insights into almost any subject come not necessarily from those who are the greatest experts, but those who have some awareness, some knowledge of that subject, enough to be able to make certain kinds of inferences, have certain intuitions, and they're not burdened by what they know. If you know too much about a subject, then in some ways that can actually become a burden. And that is why I'm not necessarily referring to that higher state of awareness, higher state of knowledge as a kind of a hierarchy. Yeah, I don't
Got it.
think I would like to think of it as a hierarchy. Yeah.
Got it. Got it. Okay. And then how does one learn? I mean, that's also a pretty heavy question, but yeah, are there like
Yeah.
any.
How does one learn? Well, that's the subject of a book, right? Because okay, let's begin with the conventional understanding. The conventional understanding is, in fact, what I've already conveyed to you. That typically most people think that one learns actually in a classroom, right? So that there is a hierarchy. So let's be very clear. In a hierarchy, in a classroom, there is a hierarchy. Whether it's actually a kindergarten or secondary school or even university, even a postgraduate seminar, there is a kind of a hierarchy. The supposition is that the person at one end of the room knows something that they are going to be able to convey to the student, and the student is then the humble recipient of that knowledge or
Knowledge.
information. Okay, right? So this is conventionally how people think really of learning. Now I think that we can of course have, I think, a more subtle understanding of what is involved in that. The first thing I would point to is the fact, and in fact, I tell that to my students quite often, especially undergraduate students, is that you're going to have to pretty much unlearn everything if you want to think along with me. Okay. That is to say that, look, I'm going to, so let's say I'm teaching a course on history. Now, what are they accustomed to? They are accustomed to history as a set of events, okay, which occurred at a certain point in time. So, conventionally speaking, people attach a lot of importance to things like dates when they think of history, okay? And if you look in India, particularly, all your questions that you get in school and even at college level, it's all based essentially on what I would call a very textbook notion of history. Now, you can get a more sophisticated textbook version, which would obviously look at not just dates and events, but would also look at things like causality, right? So, what is it that precipitates a certain set of events? Okay, and why do these events unfold at a certain point in time rather than at another point in time? Now you can get even a more sophisticated, you can go to a yet more sophisticated understanding of it, because at what point does a certain event or incident enter into history? Okay, so for example, a person crosses a river and they've crossed that same river 10,000 times in the last 50 years, but at one point that crossing comes into history for a certain reason, and those other 50,000 times it doesn't come into history. Okay, at one point might be when that person is crossing in a boat and the boat capsizes and 100 people get killed, but that person survives, right? So then that enters into something that you might call history. Otherwise, those 50,000 passages never enter into anything that we call history, right? Okay, now at the most you can get up to that level, I would say, in conventional kinds of learning. To unlearn means that one has to start thinking very differently about history. Okay, and so here's a question that I pose to my students. I just posed it actually to a class that I just started teaching in the new term, which started on Monday. So this is the question that I posed to them. I said to them, let's think about 3 or 4 social science disciplines. Okay, and of course the first thing before we even get to these disciplines is, when did disciplines arise? Okay, when is it that we started compartmentalizing knowledge? And some people will say it goes back to remote antiquity. Well, it is true that there are different words for different disciplines, broadly speaking. So if you're doing grammar in Sanskrit, it's called vyakran. If you're doing history, it's called itihas. But itihas is actually a very complicated category,
Turmoil.
because the Mahabharata is called itihas. But don't read the Mahabharata as a work of history. That would be ridiculous. In fact, that's the problem with Hindu nationalists, that they're trying to read this work as a work of history, which is a bit absurd, frankly. Okay, so so we can look at these categories that they were, but the disciplines as we know them, the modern disciplines, in fact, really go back only a couple of centuries. The idea that a university would demarcate this unified field of knowledge. You see, we like to believe that knowledge is a unified field, but then the university
Actually.
actually operates on the assumption that there are going to be dozens of disciplines, and within disciplines there are going to be sub-disciplines and subfields. And of course, the nature of the modern university is that most people will have a fragmentary sort of view of knowledge to begin with. Okay. All right. Now, the interesting thing, going back to what I had started with, which is that, so
How does
let's
one
take
learn?
geography, let's take history, let's take economics, let's take anthropology, let's take four social science disciplines. So the question is, I ask the students, tell me in one word, how would you describe history? In one word, how would you describe geography? In one word, how would you describe anthropology? That is, what is the special provenance of each of these disciplines? I seldom, if ever, get a correct reply. This last week, for the first time in 10 years, a student used the word that I was looking for to describe what history deals with. And what does it deal with? Most people will say it deals with the past. And some people will say it deals with people or this or that. None of which, because of course, all the other disciplines deal with people too. Anthropology deals with people, sociology deals. So what is the special provenance? And the past is not the correct answer. The correct answer is time. It deals with temporality. Geography deals with space.
Peace.
Space. And in fact, in the social sciences, virtually all knowledge exists at the intersection of temporality and spatiality. And you can translate temporal concepts into spatial concepts and spatial concepts into temporal concepts. Let me give you a very simple illustration. Now, this is all part, I'll give you that illustration, but this is all part of unlearning what they have learned. Because what they have learned in school generally makes it impossible for them to think productively unless they're in a very different frame of mind. And so, what I attempt to do when I think of learning is I attempt to put students in a different frame of mind. Okay, now let me give you that illustration of translating spatial concepts into temporal or temporal into spatial. So, if I ask somebody, okay, what is the developing world? Okay, so you know that typically, so in social sciences, geographers, economists, many others will say there's a developed world and there's a developing world. And then what do? You identify. So if I give somebody a map, but I've already giving a map is already putting it into spatial concept. What I want to suggest is it's actually a temporal concept. You'll see that in a moment. But let's say if I give them a map and say, okay, where's the developing world? Most people will mark most of Africa. They might mark portions of Asia, including perhaps India. Right? India, I think, would still, large parts of India would still have to be considered as part of the developing world. There's no
Developing.
question about it whatsoever, right? Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc., etc. Now, most students are convinced that this is a spatial concept. What I tell them is, no, it's a temporal concept. Why is it a temporal concept? Why is it a concept having to do with time? Because the supposition is, so if you think, let's say this is a line here, okay, and you're at point A on the line, and you move further along the line and you get to point B, and then you get to point C. So point C is the most advanced state. That's where the US is. That's where Japan is, Western Europe. Point B is maybe where China is, okay? And point C is where Sudan and the Congo, etc. are, okay? Now, the point is that these developing countries are being urged to get to point B and then from there to point A. Okay. But remember that the countries that are sitting at point A is not going to continue to sit there. They're going to point C, they're going to continue to move beyond point C. But if you put it temporally, what it means is
It's a moving
that
window.
what it means is that my present, if I'm an underdeveloped country or underdeveloped person, okay, my present is that person's past. And my future is that person's present. You see what I mean? Okay?
Yeah, yeah.
Which means that the fate of all the countries that are developing are simply to try to catch up, okay? That is with some other countries. Let's put it in a different language. That my only destiny, if I'm an Indian or if I'm from Sudan or if I'm from Bangladesh, okay, or Rwanda, is to live someone else's history, not my own. Okay, now you see what we're doing here. What we're doing is we're talking about a very different way of understanding the world around us.
Correct,
Okay,
correct, correct.
and this
But
is
no, sorry to interrupt, but does this mean that it's a moving window and that's why history is always a slice of time and not really because you can't really point anything, right? Then.
no. I mean, I don't know that a slice of time. Well, everything is a slice of time in a way. Okay, so the question is, how does one think of time? I mean, typically, what's happened is that the past, in the conventional sense, they think of it as what we would call empty homogeneous time. Okay, so it's a conception where you, so to speak, fill it with certain concepts. Okay, and the supposition also is, by the way, the supposition also is that there is a very clear trajectory from the past to the present to the future. Okay, now I think that of course has to be, and incidentally, this whole sense of being underdeveloped, developing, and being developed, this also assumes in a way a certain notion of temporality of the kind that I'm talking about here when I'm talking about the past, the present, the future. This tripartite division is something that we would have to really think about, because in a way it mimics, you see, the tripartite division of how history came to be taught. Think of it for a moment. You will agree with me that almost invariably, even today, even after all the sophistication that we have, that is the kind of work that has been done and the kinds of theories that have been floating around for the last 50, 60 years. Typically, when you teach history in a school, okay, and even I would say university level courses, how is history demarcated? It's demarcated into ancient, medieval, and modern. Okay. Now, when did this tripartite division start? Who started it? Where did it originate from? And how did it become every country's way of doing history? I can guarantee you, all you have to do is you have to look at the syllabus and Malaysia and Rwanda and XYZ country and UK and USA and India, you're going to find that this is how it's done: ancient, medieval, modern. Okay. And this is apart from the question that the word medieval is a very devilish word, because it is actually a pejorative word. And the problem is that Europe's medieval ages, for which the other word was dark ages, they were not our dark ages, by the way. In India, I don't view
Correct.
the medieval period as the dark ages at all. But but the template was adopted. You see, everywhere around the world. So the problems I'm pointing to are different kinds of problems, because I'm also pointing to the difficulty that we have in countries like India, where by and large the templates of European knowledge systems were just simply borrowed lock, stock, and barrel by us. So your question in the abstract about what is learning is really in the abstract, also in the sense that the problems are not necessarily completely identical, that there are some problems which I think are actually common wherever one is speaking about learning. But then I think when it comes to countries like India, countries that had been colonized, I think we have an additional set of problems. And that has to do with the fact that our conceptions of learning and education and pedagogy, all of these have been taken lock, stock, and barrel from the West, frankly.
So,
Yeah.
sir, in fact, I'm just going to club these two questions. And in other conversations in this series about learning, I'm trying to understand also many other aspects. But in this case, I see that India probably needs a reset in thinking about it. So, what to learn should be locked first, or why to learn should be locked first? If we have to obviously think about it systematically, assuming it's a blank slate, it will never be. But still, if we have to like think grounds up in terms of how do we learn as one nation, one civilization, or one community of people.
Well, I don't know that we should have one way of thinking about it. I think so I think that I don't know that I would agree with that supposition. So, for example, the new education policy for that has been issued in India. So this is a way to kind of set India on a uniform template. I think
Hmm.
that's a myth, frankly.
Hmm.
There are lots of critiques of NAP, but one of the critiques that I have not heard of, which I think should be the principal critique first, is that it's a mistake to kind of homogenize the question of how learning should take place. How it takes place in a community that is a Adivasi community, for example, or a Dalit community, or a community in let's say, a slum in
Hmm.
Bombay, as opposed to a wealthy neighborhood in some other city. And just taking four very different examples, no, I don't think that we can think of learning as being of one and the same kind in all of these
Hmm.
circumstances.
Hmm.
Okay.
No, but why we should learn if this is well defined, and it's obviously completely autonomous for different set of people, different communities. But the why can there be a framework for why one should learn?
Oh, well, I mean, that framework can simply be a humanist framework that one should learn,
Hmm.
because that's how one becomes aware. That's how one becomes, in fact, fully human.
Hmm.
Remember, I said learning, not being educated formally. That's a different
Hmm.
thing.
Correct.
Because there
Beautiful.
is, for example, if there is, even in India, it's very small, but even in India, there is a kind of a deschooling kind of
Hmm.
movement. The idea that, see, schooling. Let's just spend a minute or two on that,
Yeah.
because this is related to the question of why we should learn.
Hmm.
And I think learning is the better word rather than schooling or being educated. And I'll tell you why. Because the first thing to think about is, if you think about schooling, the idea of mass schooling, okay, I think you will agree with me that no matter what kind of political system one is speaking about in the modern world today, whether you're speaking about a democracy or a state that is autocratic, or a monarchy or totalitarian, no matter what kind of state it is, there is a general understanding that children should be schooled, they should be
Hmm.
educated. Okay, that is one of the things that has now gotten universal assent. It doesn't always happen for various reasons. That's a different matter. So, for example, in Gaza, it's very difficult to think about schooling today,
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
the schools have all been destroyed by the state of Israel.
Hmm.
Okay, and in Sudan, it's very difficult to think about schooling, because half the country is internally displaced.
Hmm.
Now, those are different things. In
Correct.
principle, the idea of schooling has been adopted by every society, universal schooling. One possible exception is the Taliban with respect to girls, but let's not get into that. I'm
Hmm.
saying that the general idea is widely prevalent. Now, this is a very modern thing. It goes back only to, frankly, the late 18th century, when the French Revolution took place. One
Hmm.
of the laws that was passed was a law of universal schooling. Okay,
Hmm.
1790s. That's the first time really anywhere. The idea that the masses should be schooled. But
Hmm.
let's not forget that Immanuel Kant, the so-called great philosopher
Hmm.
of the Enlightenment, as it were, okay, one of the gigantic figures of philosophy in the world, he was very clear that the reason schooling was important was because it was the most productive way to
Active,
produce dutiful, obedient
the end.
students who would be good subjects of the state, you see.
Hmm. Hmm.
Okay, now that is precisely the problem with schooling. Okay,
Hmm.
that the schooling actually is designed to create all over the world dutiful students,
Hmm.
obedient students. And of course, I don't think you can have happy societies with just dutiful, obedient students.
Hmm.
Okay,
And
so,
and does it come with a bit of insecurity that if it's not done, there will be anarchy?
well, that may well be the case, that they're going to be, but I don't know that it comes really with insecurity so much as the
The
feeling
intent
that in
of.
some ways that the project of the state cannot be considered complete, you see.
Hmm.
Okay, I mean, you're right in the sense that, if you don't, if the state is not producing these dutiful, obedient subjects, then the problem is that they may get off course, and
Hmm.
if they get off course, then they're obviously a source of dissent or trouble. But dissent is too strong a word, but they're a source of some kind of anxiety, social anomie. Societies cannot be properly ordered if you don't have a certain kind of modicum of education or schooling that these children have received. Now, learning, I think, can be differentiated because the first thing we have to think about also is, historically speaking, there have been multiple sites of learning in every society. In India, learning could take place under a tree. A teacher sits there with students, and that's very different than sitting in a classroom. It's very different because there's a different kind of intercourse that you have with nature, a different relationship you have to nature. Okay, it could take on the bank. This learning could be in a temple. It could be on the banks of a river. It could even take place during moments of being itinerant, that you walk along and you keep on talking, conversing. Okay, and teachers and students did that typically. And even in Europe, that was quite common. The philosophers would walk with their students.
Correct.
Okay, and let's not forget that in ancient Greece, the model that everyone is familiar with is
The
the
Plato.
model of the agora, the marketplace, the agora, right? So you go to Athens. I was there just a couple of years ago, saw the agora where Socrates would wander around. What would he do? He would
Yeah.
strike up a conversation. He would strike up a conversation with someone like me or you and say, well, what do you think beauty is? Or what is truth? And then if you've read The Republic, you know that it's a 400, 500 page book, and that's what it gets into. Because somebody gives an answer, then Socrates will gently try to suggest what the problem is with that answer, and they keep on going at it. That's the Socratic method. Now, this is all learning, you see, and it's taking place in a number of different sites, a number of places. One of the problems of the modern world, I think we are very conceited as moderns. We think that we know everything and that what we know is the best way of knowing. In fact, I think to the contrary, the modern world is very impoverished in many ways too. And this is a spectacularly good way in which, interesting way, or troubling way, I should say, in which it is in fact impoverished, which is that the sites of learning have all been reduced to a formal institution known as the school, okay, which encompasses the university. So, for example, in American English, it's very common. What school do you go to? If you're asking a 20-year-old, it means what college are you going to? Because it's still schooling. It's a higher level of schooling, but it's institutionalized in a certain way. I think that that is a tragedy
Yeah.
for our times. I
Correct,
think
correct.
that there have to be many ways in which we have to think about the different sites of learning as well.
We'll come to this sites of learning and overall commodification of learning in a bit. We have tried to understand what is learning or how learning happens, but how does, say, history, politics shape of what we learn? Like, how do these institutions or establishments decide what the current generation or the future generation is supposed to learn? Any key events that has, or maybe any examples?
Yeah, I mean, your question is how does history and politics, for example, shape our concept of what we think
The,
we need to learn? Okay,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And
correct.
let simplest illustration and perhaps the most crucial one: global warming. Today, if you think of global warming, isn't it the case that now our pedagogy will have to reflect an awareness of global warming? 40 years ago, who was talking about global warming? Nobody was, almost. There was a Club of Rome, obviously, but the phrase global warming doesn't even really come into existence. Okay, climate change. Now, your question is how do history and politics and things that are happening around us, how do they shape our sense of what is learning? I think this is the simplest illustration, that now we understand that our textbooks, our education, our knowledge, our learning will have to reflect an awareness of something called global warming and climate change, right? Because we now understand that one of the fundamental problems is not simply the warming of the earth, okay, and the fact that they're catastrophic or extreme weather events that are massively changing societies, producing what are called climate refugees. We are aware now of the fact that we have to think of a planetary existence where the humans beings are just one species. That's now the learning, the pedagogy that we are going to have, and we are beginning to have in some countries, is reflecting that. So this is, I think, the clearest illustration of. I mean, one could obviously point to a great many things because uh, take the question of, let's say, genocide. Genocide is a central subject in history and politics, and if you look at what is happening in Gaza today, you're seeing a genocide in real time. In real time. The student who is in the 10th grade or 11th grade is reading about the Holocaust and reading about it with a certain amount of disbelief. How was this even possible? Well, they can actually understand it much better by simply looking at what is happening in Gaza right now, where the entire world, in some ways, is complicit. Of course, most evidently, of course, the United States with Israel and Western Europe, right? But the point is that what was it that was said after the Holocaust? What was it that was said after the Rwandan genocide, after the Cambodian genocide? Never again. And of course, it's happening again, and it will certainly happen again. I'm very sorry to say that because I don't think we are in humanity is in that enlightened state where it's not going to happen again. In fact, it might happen very soon, given the state of affairs in the world. Right. So I think that more than answers your question.
Yeah, yeah. And also, if I have to like take a different route for the same question, is that a lot of times political narratives change the history itself. Like, how would one learn in this like noisy setup?
Oh no, but I mean that's a problem that exists all the time. I mean, one could point to thousands of illustrations of that, right? So, your question is that if the political narrative is now changing, the politics has become such in a certain country that it begins to change the historical narrative of the past, right? And then how do we think about learning? What it means is that it makes learning more difficult, makes it a more
Correct.
perilous task. It means that the educator will have to become a lot more reflective. Will have to actually have the tools to be able to also ward off the pressure. Let's take a very simple illustration. The president of the United States just 3 or 4 days ago passed an executive order, which is ludicrous, and I'm not overstating it, ludicrous. Okay. And what is that executive order? It's an executive order to restore sanity and truth to American history. That's what it is. Because he's saying that if you look at American institutions such as the Smithsonian Institution and so on, oh, they have all falsified, the great American past. They're denigrating the achievements of the founding fathers and all of that because, he sees everything that has happened in the last so many decades, which he all encompasses under so-called DEI, right? Diversity, equity, inclusiveness. Now, this is speaks exactly to your question. The politics changing, so he's now trying to change the historical narrative. But the point is this, Kedar, that even without such an executive order, this just simply amplifies the problem 50
Amplified.
times. But this kind of tussle is happening all the time in the course of everyday life. That people produce a certain account of the past, and then there are others who contest it. These contestations take place all the time. So there's nothing spectacularly different about it. It's just, as I said, that now it's being amplified and it's being given an enormous power of the state with the possibility of punishment of those who don't go along with, the revised narrative, right? But of course, when it goes when the trend is moving in that direction and it's coming to the point where you now begin to fear as an educator that you have to subscribe to a certain path, then that tells you that obviously the country is on a very perilous path, and we have seen that happen in a number of countries including India. Yeah.
Yeah, but when you say that these are being amplified by certain people, and especially in India now with even cinema, right? Certain things are very amplified.
Yeah.
So if one has to think about learning and also being educated, not in the schooling sense, but generally being a better human, a better society in general, right? Are there any solutions, right? Like self-learning versus say experiential learning, or just consuming this new media is a very dangerous path
Yeah.
that we are on. So how
Yeah.
would how would you look at learning in the new time? Is there a right balance where we can find out? Because
Well,
yes, there are positives about the new media as well, right? I mean, there are certain people, hopefully the Gyaan project is one of them, that you're trying to understand and document some good thoughts, while there are some good to know and good to do kind of channels as well. So how
yeah.
does one learn now?
Well, there's so many dimensions to this that it's going to be a challenge to try to encapsulate it within a 5 minutes, let's say. But let's look at it this way. First, let
Hmm.
me say that no, I don't think that what you're doing is actually a new form of
Hmm.
media. Podcasts have a long history. They were not called podcasts.
Hmm.
The BBC used to do this 5 decades ago.
Hmm.
Okay. But they were not called podcasts at that time. In fact, podcast is when people speak about new social media, I think that the phrase is more appropriately used for things like Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, all of that.
Hmm.
There, by the way, I take a view which you and the other listeners may not take, but in my view, almost all of that is junk. Almost all of it. I think it should be. I think it's completely inimical to any serious kind of thinking. And if somebody reminded me that that 10 great thinkers all had Twitter accounts, well, that's their privilege. I think
Hmm.
it's unfortunate if they have them, and I don't care if leading public figures in India, public intellectual figures have Twitter accounts and all of that. But I
Hmm.
think all of that is actually quite inimical to what I would call serious thought and reflection
Hmm.
and learning. Podcasts, I think, are very different, which is why I consented to do this, because it's possible to have a serious discussion. And as I said, there's actually a much older history, which goes back almost shortly after shortly after the beginning of radio, actually. So
Hmm.
you have to really look at the history of radio, and you'll see that conversation. Because what are we having? We're having a conversation,
Hmm.
okay, on a certain set of questions related to one subject, and this has actually happened on radio over a very long period of time. It's just the difference now is that now you can actually have the same conversation on the internet. So therefore, obviously, it
The distribution is
the
bigger.
distribution is much greater, but that's a different question. Okay.
Hmm.
The form hasn't really changed that much, because to
Hmm.
what extent can the form of conversation change anyhow, if you
Hmm.
think about it, right? It can't really. Okay.
Hmm.
Now,
Hmm.
uh, let me go to some other elements of this question. So I think that what are the ways in which we might think about learning today? How do we take it forward? How do we try to give it a kind of a secure foundation in view of all the challenges from
Hmm.
social media, various forces of disruption. Look, I think one thing to think about is this, that yes, it is true that all of social media, you see, is predicated on the idea of instant gratification.
Hmm.
Okay. That you what is Twitter? You only have so many characters that you can do. Okay, right? Even Instagram, Facebook, the people don't generally write, very long posts. Okay,
Hmm.
the idea is that you read something in 15 seconds, and therefore there is a common assumption that we don't any longer have the power of concentration. Now, I
Hmm.
think to some extent that is true. I think that we have lost certain kinds of faculties. Okay, we have lost certain kinds of faculties that we had. So let me give you a different kind of way of thinking about this for a moment.
Hmm.
So take something like rote learning. I think it's almost universally condemned. It's almost universally condemned. That doesn't mean that it's been abandoned. It still happens,
Hmm.
but it's been condemned by most educators across societies and so on. And one of the ways, for example, in which the West talks about madrasas, they'll say, "Oh, just look at these." I don't know how many documentaries I've seen where there's a little clip of boys in a madrasa somewhere in Afghanistan or Pakistan or Sudan or wherever, and the boys are just mindlessly reciting,
Hmm.
okay, the Quran, and that's all they know. All of education simply means you know the Quran, you know everything in the world. Now that would be rote learning, okay, and that's what's being condemned. But I have to also say this. Whether I agree with that, what some people might call caricature, it's not really. I'm not saying that that's what happens in a madrasa necessarily. That's how it's usually represented. For example, in
Hmm.
the Western
Hmm.
media, and even by liberals in India, I would say they'd say "Ki this is what happens in the madrasa. Okay, and not liberals as much as, let's say, Hindu nationalists. They'd say that's what happens in a madrasa. Let's not worry about whether that's actually what happens there or not. The point is this: that rote learning is condemned generally.
Correct.
But I can also tell you this. As someone who grew up in India and who experienced rote learning, I also understand some things that I gained from it. And so the first, and I'll tell you what I gained from it in a moment, but the first thing I want to emphasize, therefore, is this: that I think this entire subject will require a huge amount of reflection on the part of educators to think about certain assumptions that they have. Okay, because I think that for everything that you needs to be condemned, there is something that can be extracted from it which is actually quite important and interesting. So, what is it in the case of rote learning? For example, is there a relationship of rote learning to memorization, and in turn between memorization and poetry? See, I think in order to be a good poet, you also need powers of memorization, because poetry is not simply a matter of words written in a certain way using certain meters. It's the sound and the music of poetry which is critically important, actually. Okay.
The rhythm part of it.
Yeah, okay. It's very important. And we have to remember that in India, all the texts came down to us through an oral tradition. The richness of Indian culture has to do in part with the fact that things came down in oral tradition, which meant that a text could have 100 different variations, because people, if it comes down in an oral tradition, it also meant that people chose to remember some things, chose not to remember other things. There were some choices that were made too. It's very interesting if you think about the intellectual history of India and you think about how text came down. Nothing was written originally, okay?
Correct.
Everything was committed to memory, what people would call rote learning, actually. It was committed to memory. Now, I think that those powers of memory, for example, have largely disappeared from modern culture. I've even met people who don't remember their own phone number. Okay, they don't even remember. They just basically have look at their own phone to figure out what their phone number is, and they don't remember anyone's number. Because you don't have to remember any of that. You see. So I think that when you don't use a faculty for a long period of time, you actually begin to lose that faculty. And I think that something is lost in civilization with that. You see.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Now that's I'm just giving you one dimension of that, because then we can get to a very different kind of dimension. That is a dimension, for example, of how does one discipline oneself? You see. And I think that this is where the idea of being a Karam yogi is important. See, the real Karam yogi is someone who, if I may put it in this fashion, can engage in the slum of everyday life and still remain detached. I think this was, by the way, the fundamental genius of Mohandas Gandhi. Because unlike our previous spiritual figures, and I think Gandhi has to be seen as a spiritual figure also. Of course, he's a critically important political figure, but we all know he's not a political figure in the same way in which anyone else was a political figure. And for decades, everybody was baffled. Is he a politician or is he a saint? He's too much of a saint to be a politician. He's too much of a politician to be a saint. I mean, I can't tell you how many thousands of people in his own lifetime were writing up just about this kind of thing. The important point is this: that Gandhi was quite certain there was no point in going up to the top of a mountain and standing on one leg there for 50 years and getting into the Guinness Book of World Records, okay, and or meditating, in some cave for 50 years. No, that if you're really going to, it's like you have to be the bodhisattva, right? You come down to the earth, so to speak, and make yourself useful as a human being to others. Okay?
Yeah.
Useful
Yeah.
is a
Yeah.
very pedestrian word, but I'm using it with deliberation.
Accessible. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So that is what I meant. That his idea was that the real test of your your capacity to adhere to a certain kind of ethics. The real test of your ability to adhere to a certain code of life, a moral code of life, is if you're engaged with everyday life. Don't let the clutter of everything disturb the equanimity. So, the way I look at social media, I don't myself take part in it, but I don't get too ruffled by it either. Okay. If somebody is engaged with it, let them engage with it. I think that their life gets impoverished. That's my own view, but I don't see it as my brief to lecture them on that, because what I see as being fundamentally important is this: that in the midst of all the noise around you, in the midst of all the clutter, all the confusion, all the desperation induced by modern day politics, for example, you continue to do what you have to do. Remain true to yourself. I think that is also, that brings us back full circle. What should learning do? I think this is foremost what learning should do, is it should inculcate in you a sense of who you are, how you,
Beautiful.
so to speak, become secure with yourself and learn to stand, so to speak, in the midst of everything, even if things are falling around you, right? Now, I think that this is actually centrally important. And I think this is the real meaning of being an adherent of Karam Yoga. That's my view. And I
No
think
way.
that the Indian tradition actually, if it's properly understood, can be extraordinarily instructive in all of these matters.
Beautiful, beautiful. In fact, I was going to ask you key takeaways, but this is the biggest takeaway for one to action upon, to just learn, stay equanimous, and do your, as they say, swadharma. Like keep
Yeah,
doing it, and then
that's great.
you'll,
Yeah.
yeah, cool. I think we can conclude on this note, and I'm really, really honored to have you on the show. Lot of learning, lot of food for thought. New reflections will come while I'll be editing this. Thanks a lot, Vinay sir, for giving your time. It was really a great conversation.
Oh, I've enjoyed it. It's been fun. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening till the end. Do check out Vinay Lal's books. All links are in the description. If this conversation made you pause or reflect, drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe to the Gyaan Project. You can explore more at thegyanproject.com, and more links in the description to be part of this journey. Until next time, keep learning and keep unlearning, as Vinay sir calls it.